Welcome to the Big Dawg Crypto Podcast. This is your number one crypto podcast to hear directly from the movers and shakers, innovators, and disruptors in the cryptocurrency industry. Follow on Twitter for updates and to communicate directly at Woof Big Dawg. That's at Woof Big DAWG. Now, here is your host, the one and only Big Dawg Crypto.
And welcome to the latest episode of the Big Dawg Crypto Podcast. I am your host, Big Dawg Crypto. This is now our 30th episode. And for your 30th episode, you want to get a special guest if you can. And if you've paid attention to Twitter and crypto Twitter, you know this man right here, Crypto Bird. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing really good. Really excited to actually, kick off with saying that, there definitely have been, several attempts for us to align. There are different time zones, but I definitely am happy to finally be here and look at it. 30th episode. Congratulations, man. Well done.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And did I say your name right? It's Bird, right?
Well, my real name is Adrian. Adrian Zduńczyk. I kind of come from Poland overall. I'm based in Portugal right now. Crypto Burp, or Burp, is a nickname I got, for my kind of a trading career, and that I found, basically sound funny and catchy, back in 2017, and that's how it stuck by somehow.
All right. I just want to make sure I did, because I noticed too now, of course, you got your name or your Twitter account and everything, and you really are. I said that earlier, and I mean this. To me, I say on Twitter, the best way to really learn about crypto or to follow stuff, right, is to follow accounts that have good content, that have had not just solid calls, but their analysis has been good. And there's no doubt, man, you're at the top of the whole content creators, in my opinion, especially on crypto Twitter. Now, you also have a podcast too. I guess a couple of things I want to ask you. First one is, how did you get into crypto originally? Do you remember what you were doing the first time when you first got into it?
Yeah, good question. I guess the simplest answer is, that back in 2017, after me and my friend, had been actually working on some sort of a startup, coming with a subscription box, that you put in some gear and stuff and gadgets, into a subscription box, and you send it to the people, on a monthly, quarterly, or whatever basis. Then after a year of working on it, somehow, I guess, there was an overall boom, and the crypto train has just started leaving. Would just start leaving the station, and I'm talking about the early stages of 2017, where many first altcoins really were popping up out there. So the very serious first altcoin season, I think, was the very time I actually got into crypto on active basis. Before, I used to hear a lot, about Bitcoin 2014 when my studies, my main chemical technology kind of in background, brought a lot of friends from the IT sphere, the programmers, coders, and they would be some turbo geeks, they would just talk about some fancy stuff, from the software, hardware, and there were, of course, the miners. There were, crypto mining, and of course, when there was Mt. Gox collapse in 2014, I remember this kind of during the winter exam window session in my studies. I remember hearing about that. However, I couldn't really engage because that was not very my first and foremost priority, right? So it hadn't been really until 2014 that I truly started getting this active phase of crypto for my side. Yeah.
You've been 8 years. That is beyond an OG. You have a lot of experience in the space. And your podcast. So what year did you decide to start the podcast? And also too, I was why did you decide to start the podcast?
Yeah. So podcast is actually my podcast, it's called The Nest Show. The Nest Show podcast, it's been, I think, the third year overall. Ever since 2020 basically started, this COVID pandemic came in. There was an, of course, overall, I say tide and wave of many new podcasts coming, right? So there was the time, that You know, I think Joe Rogan is really, you know, Joe Rogan is really right now, of course, the most famous podcaster you have on Spotify, and that was all about the time that the podcasts were really becoming a thing. You know, I mean, I used before that, of course, I heard of many other podcasts, you know, but it was not really something that I truly anticipated or looked, you know, out for. Until I decided, like I said, there was this kind of like a threshold, you know, this breakthrough moment on my side that I decided that I want to get to speak to brand new audience, that I want to have some regularity in the way I meet certain people, right? So the fact that we're talking here today is also a good thing, right? It's also a great thing because, well, it builds certain bridges, and I'm a big fan of building bridges much more than destroying them, for sure.
I like that. I like that. I mean, that gets into the content creation. So I got in about 17 also, and I find looking at stuff and learning about it back then versus now, there's no doubt that there's a lot more content. One of the things that I get a lot of people with the podcast that are newer to the space, and so I bring this up because specifically with you, who have a lot of experience, you've been in the space 8 years, what do you recommend to the new person, the new guy or girl that are like tuning in and they're like, I want to learn about crypto, but they don't know whether it's Twitter, YouTube, whatever. What kind of advice would you share with them is probably the best way, a couple of different ways, right, to go about and learn about the cryptocurrency space?
I think this is paradoxically a very complex question, or the answer to this is very complex, right? Because typically when anything that regards money, anything that regards finance, you know, investing, trading is extremely subjective, as in people tend to believe that there is this one holy grail formula, that this one amazing golden equation that when you put it in the brackets, when you actually implement it on your side, then overnight you're going to appear and wake up rich, right? So I wish there was something to it. I wish there was a substance that can make you a better trader, basically, like a good trader pill or something like this. But it's not true either, right? So in very big majority of cases, it's always a bumpy road. It's never going to be a straight line. And in fact, just like if you have a look at any chart, you know, it's always going to have its series of ups and downs. And that's exactly how a good, I should say, trader's career may look like, right? It's never going to be a single straight one line. And in fact, instead, you're going to look at a bumpy road. And I guess the strongest advice is solving something that where the majority fails, and the majority fails because of starting to get hopeless after they face the first, second, or third, you know, loss. At times, you know, that's not something we can control. At times, the losses come in a clump of 5 or 6 or 10, 15 losses in a row. However, it doesn't mean it's going to continue like this forever, right? As we know, in fact, like, you know, the best performing strategies are the ones which tend to bring a lot of losses in a row. It's called trend following. I myself, I'm a trend follower, which means that I trend the trends. I am late to the party much more often than not. I'm wrong about 70% of the time. But then if I'm right 3 out of 10, you know, then because the larger trend develops, I can fully catch this so-called fat tail and basically compensate for all the losses that I got.
So that brings to technical analysis and the different parts of it. Somebody learning TA, what are probably 2 of the 1, 2, 3? I mean, what parts of technical analysis would you tell somebody trying to learn about it, right, to pay attention to, or to study, or to put as the top of their list to learn about TA?
Yeah. Well, you know, like I said, you know, it's always going to be subjective a little bit, but in my opinion, you know, from my experience, I think the greatest skill a good technical trader, a trader who would base, you know, their trading decisions of technical analysis, basically, is a skill of recognizing patterns and trends, right? So patterns are existent everywhere. They exist. There is a pattern in the behavior that that we learned back in ancient times when we would be chased, you know, by tigers or some massive, I don't know, rhinoceros or whatever, you know. So the pattern would be this kind of like a negative feedback, right? Loop, as in when you see a tiger, you know it's time to get your stuff and get running, right? Otherwise, not really recognizing such a pattern would mean that you're basically left there, for death, right? You're left there to die. So I guess the nature, somehow wanted it this way that it started, I think, feeding our brain with hormone of happiness, which is dopamine, anytime we recognize a pattern successfully, right? So this is something that it seems to be preferred by nature, right? Because there's this instant reward for your brain. So your brain gets addicted to recognizing patterns. And there's the other end to it, that you can actually just outdo this, as in because your brain desires it, this hormone of happiness so much, right? It's so addictive that you basically start seeing patterns even when they don't exist. And that is exactly, let's say, where where taking a wheel, basically driving a car in the street, and there is this black cat crossing, a road. Then you're like, oh, holy shit, there is this black cat. It always brings bad luck, right? So I better stop. And the moment they stop, there's another car running right into their back, right, and crashing into them. So this self-fulfilling prophecy effect also becomes, I should say, part of it. And understanding that, well, one thing, is recognizing the patterns and trends is something that definitely helps a good technical analyst trade well. And at the same time, the other point, I would argue that having this overall persistence and understanding that just because, in the past you've had perhaps, 10 or 15 losses, it does not mean that it's going to continue like this forever, right? In fact, it's countering something that we know as a representativeness bias or a form of saliency, where we would extrapolate from small sample, right? Taking the last pattern or taking the last 10 losses and assume it's going to extrapolate like that forever. But there is no guarantee it's going to happen like this. In fact, more often than not, it does not happen. So those are the 2 points I'd say.
Do you, when it comes to technical analysis and fundamental analysis, would you put yourself in a percentage of one, like I'm 50 this, or I'm 70? What percentages would you break your analysis into?
Yeah, so I'm definitely by no means a fundamental analyst. I mean, I do understand, this overall, I should say, background of fundamental analysis, and I do have this top view, kind of like, again, understanding. I know, of course, in the regular finance, you will go and try to, project potential, put a value tag on a share, imagine, or a stock, based on their discounted cash flows, right? So what kind of discounted cash flows, a company may have, right? And how it all kind of like corresponds with, an overall interest rate or inflation rate, right? Combining all different kinds of economic data, macroeconomic data, is something that the fundamental analysis basically checks on, right? So while the technical analysis looks deep inside of the market, in the very side of the market, the FA stands outside of it, right? And it doesn't really look at the interreactions and interrelations between the market participants, which TA does, right? But it instead focuses on the market as a whole, and it doesn't really analyzes specifically what's happening between the market participants, because this is the very TA profession. So myself, being chartered market technician officially right now with this full designation, I can certainly say that I'm much more of a technical analyst than a fundamental analyst. I'd say like 80-20, 90-10, stuff like this.
And your stuff has been pretty spot on. I mean, like I said, I followed you for years, and your analysis has been really, really good. Looking at stuff now, look, and I know people are watching Bitcoin kind of going sideways. It dips under 20, then it comes back. People feel like, the market's getting boring, but then they get nervous because of everything else going on with world events, whatever. What do you see Bitcoin? Well, two-part question. Has Bitcoin bottomed for the year? And if not, when do you think it'll bottom?
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I would, the old me would try to come out and search for many different scenarios and perhaps project it, draw some lines and squiggles. Perhaps market will go this way, or perhaps it will go this way, the other way. I don't do that anymore, in all honesty. And I don't do that anymore mainly because, lots of rights or wrongs, but eventually I did understand I've got to understand that it's basically nothing else but a guess. I have no idea what the market is going to look like tomorrow or in 5 years or in 10 years, right? It's very hard to project this insane amount of real-time data that keeps flowing in, that keeps feeding, the news. There is this butterfly effect that the butterfly, just flaps its wings, tiny little wings on one side of the planet that can, spare a hurricane somewhere else, right? So with such an inflow and such an overall computerization, of the world and this access to information, it's very hard to project something that is going to happen in the next 5 minutes or a day ahead, right? There are investment banks would spend millions of dollars on trying to build some sort of like smart forecast tools, right? And there's a thing that is called ARIMA or ARIMA. This is a shortcut abbreviation, and it stands for autoregressive, kind of like moving averages in a way. So autoregressive would mean that it would take an autoregression, and kind of like build linear regression, build slopes out of the most recent points, right? And because it adjusts with certain like confidence interval. It gives you certain probability, never 100%. That it gives you certain probability thresholds or range for the next day, right? So it may tell you that within the 90% of confidence, let's say, there is going to be a move somewhere between 1.5% upwards and 1.5% downwards, from today's price to get tomorrow's price, just for instance, right? But it's still uncertain, right? Because who would have expected the specific, Russia-Ukraine, aggression and a perfect date to it, right? I would never blindly guess the date to call when the war starts. So, right. So why would I try to project, what the Bitcoin price is going to be in the next 5 years, right? So overall, understanding that those are just pure guesses, right? They can always be wrong, and most likely they're going to be wrong than right, because it's like a lottery guess again, right? So in my opinion, overall, I do think that we still have a little bit more pain to come, right? We've barely got a confirmed recession instance with 2 consecutive, GDP quarter on the decline, which puts typically this model of a business cycle, of an economy cycle, I should say, in a position where it still has a little bit more downside. Typically, when a recession starts, the financial market, which leads the financial cycle, which leads 6 to 9 months, the business cycle, typically gets somewhere closer to into the bottomish area. However, it's not fully done, right? So you would get like this 4/5 of this entire bear market kind of like thing. And that is exactly what I think may be the case, right? So ideally, I think it would make a lot of sense to basically phase into September, right? And September is typically the worst performing month of the year on average over the years. So I think September basically having this negative seasonality on its shoulders, it would make sense to anticipate a little bit more downside perhaps in September, while the seasonality effect favors the end of a quarter, at the end of a year typically, so the second half of fourth quarter to be the strongest or one of the strongest in a year. So perhaps there's more downside, perhaps there's new lows on Bitcoin. I would not be surprised for it. Perhaps it happens somewhere between $10,000 and $14,000. Perhaps it sleeps somewhere below like 17 or 16,500, 17,000. Imagine just slips beneath the lows, right, and it reverts back and stays in a range. Who knows? But I would be slightly more optimistic, I guess, as we get closer to the end of the year, November, December. Bitcoin really likes those dates to reverse historically. So we'll see.
You're right about, like you said, September traditionally has not been the best, but then end of the year tends to be a bit better. That always brings into people want to know when Altseason. When Altseason. I mean, Once again, we don't know. But if you're looking at it based on history, based on the various factors, do you even want to hazard a guess of when perhaps?
Yeah. So, like I would try to forecast, alt seasons many times, and I was, of course, humiliated by my own forecasts and predictions. So I have to be very careful. But overall, I'd say that the roadmap, to having an alt season is having a lot of popularity among traders, right? So, and it also takes time for the market to develop into a stage where there is some sort of like a mania, there is some sort of like a, overall euphoria, or such a positive and such a positive, optimistic, environment that that it sucks in people basically into the market like a vacuum, right? And it basically makes them sit down the computer and see what this entire mess is about. And that typically happens after the markets have increased a lot, right? So first, before an alt season comes in, I would say that we have to see a very strong and really definite, I should say, very well-established upwards trend, right? That would then let the others to catch up somehow late, and probably develop off of it, right? So I'd say that, I would not necessarily be expecting any sort of like an out season per se within the next, I don't know, 4-6 months maybe, right? Perhaps it comes after, perhaps there is a chance that Bitcoin bottoms, right? And it runs some immediate percentage upwards that I cannot predict, and it's going to lighten up immediately the altcoins with it. But overall, I would expect that from the moment that Bitcoin really starts a new bull market phase, right after it's bottomed, then it's probably somewhere between like 2, 3, 4, 6 months, maybe, from the bottom of the market, I'd say.
I've noticed you're very cautious in your predictions. I mean, you're very straightforward about it, and your TA has been, like I said, very accurate from what I've seen. But I've noticed you're very cautious in making predictions. Is that just because of the time, the market? I mean, you've been in this long enough that you've seen enough, like you said. We all try, because when I always tell people, somebody says, "Can you guarantee?" I say, my opinion is, this. Well, can you guarantee it? No, I can say I can guarantee if you take $5 and you take my opinion and go into the coffee shop, you'll get a coffee. Right? That's all I can guarantee. I've noticed that you're very cautious on that. You don't, Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, when the market is really treating you well and you earn a lot of money, it makes you, there's this overconfidence bias that appears on your side, right? And you start being overly optimistic and overly enthusiastic about your own predictions, and just because, like, the very opposite to what we had in the beginning, as we discussed. When you have a run of 10 losses, you would imagine that it's going to continue forever. And the other way around, when you have a run of 10 wins, because the market really favors your long positions, then all of a sudden you start believing much more strongly than, and even stronger than you probably are supposed to believe, right? And you start getting, cocky and overconfident. And that's where the biggest amount of mistakes are made. So I'm cautious about predictions. It's something relatively new. After I got my CMT designation, I think I can say that I really understood that making those predictions or trading upon those predictions is likely a losing game, right? Overall, why would I expect for the market to behave exactly like I project? One times, or not even say 5 or 10 times in a row, right? Perhaps I'm lucky. I mean, if it happens that I'm right, then it's luck and not some magic holy grail skills, right? That's it. There is no holy grail. There is only an overall stability and reliability of your trading system that you build that leads you to profit. No, some holy grail skills that you're the best trader alive. I'm definitely not the smartest trader alive. I can tell you for one, guarantee that.
I think that's why your Twitter account, that's why your podcast channel has grown, because you do give, realistic opinions on stuff and accurate, which is, it's not, you're not pushing hopium. And look, there's a lot of people that do that, and I'm not knocking those that do, but your stuff is kind of more based in reality, almost on the cautious side. So no, that's a good thing. I think, it's stuff that people can rely on. So that's good. One final thing on crypto, looking ahead, what do you want to see 5 years down the road? Like you've been in 8 years, you've been almost a decade, which is most of the time the crypto's been around. 5 years down the road, you and I know 5 months is a lifetime of crypto. What would you want to see as one or two things adoption wise in the cryptocurrency space, in the world?
Gotcha. I do think that there's an overall trend that keeps emerging, that keeps growing in terms of something that we know as adoption, right? Adoption is a process. It never happens like overnight. It never happens, just that you kind of like turn the light on and all of a sudden you wake up and everybody next to you uses cryptocurrencies, right? So I believe that the adoption is something that happens not only slowly, because it is a major shift, it is a change, that is getting imprinted in the way that people behave on a regular basis. So, just like people have adopted iPhones or Apple products overall, right? This made it iconic to an extent, like those white AirPods, right? Or those white whatever cases. So it didn't happen for Apple to make it happen overnight. It took probably a couple of years of kind of like building awareness around this. So I still would say that we are in this overall awareness building phase for mainstream, right? I still know many people who are not familiar with Bitcoin. And unless you basically talk, I don't know, to some, maybe to kids in a somewhere in the playground or in a sandbox, and they know what Bitcoin is, then because they heard about it in the TV news that they attach 0.111 Bitcoin to their McDonald's orders with a Happy Meal or something like this. And until you get this sort of popularity, I'd say that the adoption still proceeds, right? So overall, I think that 5 years down the road is really long time, right? And like I said, I have no idea if I wake up tomorrow, not even to say, if I wake up in 5 years. So it's hard to pinpoint any specific expectations. However, I do believe that if this current trend is to be sustained, if the regulators, don't really manage to screw this whole thing up, then I would argue this is much better of an opportunity than a threat to everybody, right? We know the inflation, we know that there's this overall worsening situation in the financial conditions globally, right? Governments printing infinite amount of money out of thin air. This is not something local, this is global. And this ruins the currency. This brings this overall destruction to the currency as we know it. And it does seem that eventually there is going to be this inflection point when these currency bubbles are going to be too big not to, or to sustain basically the systems. And there might be this moment in our on our timeline, of globe as a whole, that the financial systems as we know it that are based of printed currency will start getting crushed one after another. And I really mean it. I mean, the countries would start to deregulate, right? The banks would start bailing on a daily basis. And there's this entire chaos and madness that may happen. And, and I know that they might be followed basically by something that we know as CBDC, right? So central bank digital currencies. That is in the direct opposition to the private aspects of cryptocurrencies, right? So I would argue that, there are two ways. And the most positive way for crypto assumes that this current emerging trend is going to be sustained, right? And we are likely going to have this phase where you would hear about Bitcoin in every single commercial. And like I said, you could tip your, taxi driver with Bitcoin everywhere you go on the planet. Now that you could pay for groceries, around the corner to some, to some shop owners. And that would be this deep adoption level that is really makes Bitcoin well accommodated in this overall living, as we know it. And the other path, which is less optimistic, that leads to overall, regulatory pressures that really discourage, or I should say, discredit cryptocurrencies in favor of CBDCs, right? Or which are in direct opposition. And for CBDCs to kind of like quote unquote take over the thesis of cryptocurrencies, right? Perhaps both will realize. I have no idea.
I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's such a wide ranging question because, as we know, with adoption, and like you said, most people worldwide don't know what it is. I mean, yes, some have heard of it, but yeah, we're definitely in a very growing time right now, no doubt about that. Couple last personal questions. I always like people to kind of know, and they know you from Twitter, they know you from the podcast. When it comes to food, your favorite food, you're going out tonight. What kind of food are you going to eat?
I like Mexican food a lot, man. I really like tacos. I love tacos. I'm not too much of a seafood guy, but I love calamaris. I'm Polish, so there is this entire like a basic Polish food that you would get when you visit your grandma, and it's called like a kotlet schabowy. It's in Polish. It means it's like a like schnitzel, probably, right? I think it comes from Germany, right? And the schnitzel is like this pork meat, kind of like stamped and then it's fried, and it's really delicious.
Nice.
Then you have those French fries or some mashed potatoes or something, and some salad to it. So it's either a little bit more exotic, and like I said, tacos, and then some Mexican food. I love it. Or you go traditional thing that you eat when you visit your grandma. That would be just schnitzel stuff.
Nice. And when you're working, okay, you put in a lot of work. I mean, see you on Twitter, your podcast. There's a lot of stuff you do. What do you have on in the background? You have music on. You have TV. You have silence. What do you have on?
Yeah. So I had this problem that there is not enough time for me to do everything that I really wish. I'm an amateur musician, right? I do sing in one of the best men's choirs in Europe. It's called Cantores Minores, which from Latin by direct translation means like little singers or something like that. And there's this 31, 32 year long history behind the choir where the young boys back in the day, 10-year-old guys would sing, and some of those, would mature and enough to be in their mid 30s, 40s, have wives, kids, and beautiful families, and they still would sing in the same choir. So that is how this Cantores Minores name kind of like comes from. I do play the guitar, right? I do play the acoustic guitars. I have many guitars, as my wife says, way too many guitars to be considered normal, I guess. So I'm a bit mental about my guitars. I love them. I love the sound of it. I wish I could play piano well. I can put in some notes, but I'm definitely not a piano player. I wish I really had got the chance to learn to play piano though.
Well, so with that being said, what sort of music do you like? What are a couple of artists that you like? Like you say, kind of.
Yeah. So I'm not, I guess, any sort of like obsessive about anybody right now. I mean, there's of course a bunch of classics. I love Frank Sinatra, right? There's Dean Martin. I love to hear and listen to some country music at times from the 80s. I love the disco vibes from the 80s, of course. I love to hear occasionally to Justin Timberlake, when he puts out some new stuff. I love Michael Jackson. I love Prince, right? I love some good Polish music as well. That may not necessarily be the most well known outside. I rally, but still listen to some classical music, right? So because I sing at a choir, right, it would have a lot of those Renaissance and Baroque kind of like themes going on. So I do listen to this, and I'm really interested in a cappella singing, right? So there is this funny thing called barbershop quartets. I think in States people would really like it, I guess, in their 40s or 50s, where some lads, some folks would visit some local barbershops, and instead of TVs or instead of radios, they would sing to those people. And they would sing in beautiful 4-part harmony, that would ring amazingly between those four men voices. That's something that is still practiced nowadays. That's something I occasionally listen to. I enjoy that. I love harmonies in the voice. So too many probably to kind of like pinpoint just one specific artist that I favor.
Hard to do. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot, and you named a lot of the classics. Wait, so do you perform live now?
Well, there is this wedding of my sister and my brother-in-law to be, that I'm actually going to be performing. It's just one song. It's a symbolic stuff. But I just we do sing with men's choir. We participate in the contest. We actually get some auditions, play host concerts, sing the concerts. So I do perform live. However, individually, I used to have a band. But band-wise, I'm not really doing anything specific about the band. So you won't see me playing some big ass concerts, somewhere in Europe.
That was my question. You were talking about singing earlier, and performing, but I was like thinking, do you also too play guitar live? Because I could imagine if you were at a crypto convention, and that would be kind of cool. I'm just thinking that just a thought, So
maybe.
Just throwing that out there. Anyway, look, brother, I appreciate you making the time. Like I said, I wanted to have you on for a while, and as you know, and you do the podcast, 30th episode is very special, so I really appreciate it. Please let everybody know, where do they find you on Twitter, and how do they find you on YouTube?
Thank you so much. You can find me, guys, on Twitter at crypto_burb with the B, like Barbara at the very end, not bird. This is, I think, this kind of like a little bit sophisticated point that many people may confuse. And there are many scammers, of course. So I'm the one with a blue verified check mark. Twitter was very resistant to grant it, but eventually it happened. And then this is my handle. My name is Adrian Zduńczyk. Adrian Zduńczyk. My title is CMT. So you're going to find me on Twitter under Adrian Zduńczyk CMT. And besides, for the YouTube of mine, you can actually search under the Burb Nest, similar, the Burb Nest, like Barbara with the B at the end of the burb.
Crypto Burb, I appreciate it. Thank you for being on the latest episode of the Big Dawg Crypto podcast. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you very soon.
You've been listening to the Big Dawg Crypto podcast. Follow on Twitter at WoofBigDawg. Woof, big DAWG. And run faster than the competition. Woof, woof.